What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. Right now, it feels like there is an especially vicious attempt to criminalize people for being poor and for being unhoused, and politicians, particularly in California, the allegedly most progressive states in the country. Politicians like Gavin Newsom, San Francisco Mayor London Breed, others, they're saying words like, the problem with San Francisco is that we have too much compassion. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense because their careers depend on landlords and tech CEOs who are some of their biggest donors and make money off of selling surveillance equipment to cities. And what their donors have told these politicians is that they don't want to see unhoused people. And so the solution these politicians are offering to being unhoused is fines, being swept, and going to jail. Today's episode is about permanent supportive housing, which is in the realm of public housing. The government contracts out with either a landlord that's a nonprofit or in some cases private landlords. But the point is that the person living there in the permanent supportive housing has stable housing and usually has access to services that are meant to help that person continue to be housed. However, permanent supportive housing doesn't generate as much profits as things like constructing new jail cells and maintaining prisons. Not the kind of profits that the people who fund some of these politicians want to see. So you're not going to hear them talk a lot about it as a solution. And so it falls on the rest of us to talk about it. Jordan Davis is here to specifically do just that. She lives in a permanent supportive housing unit and has done some organizing around the conditions in permanent supportive housing. Trigger warning for about 30 seconds. Jordan also came out recently online about Asha Safai groping her back in 2018. Asha Safai is a local politician and mayoral candidate. Jordan put out a statement just after we had this conversation that you're going to hear. So we don't talk about the situation, but I'll read a little bit from Jordan's statement. She said, "I decided, like many survivors, not to go to the police because the criminal punishment system does not work for us. As a disabled trans femme who has experienced multiple assaults and been gaslighted, I decided, like many survivors, not to go to the police because the criminal punishment system does not work for us." Jordan put out that statement after we recorded this conversation, so we don't talk about it. Trigger warning for promo. I know you cannot start an anti-capitalist podcast and expect to make money off of it, really, but it would be very helpful if you have $5 to send us. You go to patreon.com/San Francisco. If you sign up there, we got a little bit of bonus content that we're going to start doing regularly. And you can also get things like stickers for subscribing, or my book that we recently found out was awarded a Lambda Literary Award, as well as the Stonewall Book Award from the American Library Association. Conversation with Jordan on permanent supportive housing will start about now. Thank you, Jordan, for coming on. Jordan Davis is here to talk about permanent supportive housing. One of my pet issues, of course, in San Francisco is housing, and why we allow landlords and the city that backs them to have so much power over something that everybody needs. That is just a really basic need. So yeah, thank you for coming on. I think we need to give people like the most basic of basics. What is permanent supportive housing?
So permanent support housing is basically, it's not shelter, it's not like assisted living. Basically, what it is it's housing for formerly homeless people. We're supposed to pay 30% of our income towards rent. Unfortunately, it was not like the federal standard, but it is the standard in most places, but it wasn't always that way in San Francisco. And that's something that I've mainly fought for, and you'll hear a lot about. And there's also voluntary services like employment, recovery, like stuff. And it's kind of based on a strategy called Housing First, which you may have heard of. It's basically the idea is that the first thing you need to do for homeless people is to give them a home, a subsidized home. And then, like, if they choose to address the issues, we basically are supposed to have, and we mostly have, with some exceptions, the same rights that other tenants would get. And unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot of attacks on it from like a lot of people on X and a lot of like grifters. And because of like some endemic issues that are kind of like weirdly specific to San Francisco. So I guess the overarching theme here is that supportive housing is successful even in a city like San Francisco, but there are still issues and we need to mend it, don't end it. That's sort of like idea that you can hang your hat on.
Like with public housing, that's such an issue that the right wing sort of created this ogre, this image of public housing as this scourge of the earth in order to get rid of it because they weren't making enough profit off of it. So I totally agree. This is something that needs to exist, especially in a place like San Francisco, where, as you said, 30% of someone's income is considered widely the home Housing and Urban Development Department of the United States of America has placed like 30% is about what people should be paying of their income for housing to make it affordable. That's like a level that has been set. It's like widely accepted to make sense in a lot of cases, except that because of the quote unquote housing crisis that we are most of us are in, like other than extremely rich people and landlords who own a ton of property, the rest of us are constantly having to think about how we're going to pay our rent, and the problem is getting worse and worse, and fewer people meet that level that HUD set as affordable. Would you want to say a little bit about how you became somebody who was like, I need to be an activist on this issue?
I came here to San Francisco homeless in December of 2014. I basically was homeless in Philadelphia for some time. Before that, I was involved in activism. I'm disabled, I'm transgender, and I kind of am the classic story of the queer person who goes west to find a better life. And I was like, you know what, fuck it, I'm coming to San Francisco and whatever happens, happens. So I end up here, and of course, I'm one of the lucky ones that this was before coordinated entry, got into navigation center when it was first starting, and it kind of was giving summer camp vibes for a bit because it was a lower barrier shelter. And then I got placed in permanent supportive housing, and I credit it for a lot. I was able to get back on my feet. One of the reasons I wanted to get housed was to get gender confirmation surgery, which I eventually did in 2022. But I ended up being involved in a lot of activism because, frankly, when I was in the navigation center, I dreamed that I would be able to find a subsidized apartment like somewhere else in the city, like if I had to do a voucher. But I was stuck in an SRO in the Tenderloin run by, of course, Randy Shaw from the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. They seem to have a monopoly on the housing exits. And there was just so many issues about SROs. For those who don't know, they stand for single room occupancy. They're basically these really Spartan hotels that often don't have their private bathrooms. It's just a room, no cooking facilities. It was often, buildings were built over 100 years ago. And it was like basically to house like immigrant laborers and who basically worked long hours, and it was basically cheap, no frills accommodation, like created by the capitalist class for like immigrants, so that way they could work their way up and move on. But now we're using them to house formerly homeless people who don't have jobs and basically people with high support needs. And it's ending up really, really disastrous results, as a Chronicle article talked about. I'll give you a few examples of what happened when I went in. They severely limit the how you can pay rent. They often like tell you to have a payee, even if you don't need it, if you receive disability benefits. Randy Shaw, who runs Tenderloin Housing Clinic, even believes that all tenants who receive disability benefits should have a payee. And if you don't have a payee, it's a money order. And it's something that's been like painful for a while. People on SSI were charged more than half their income towards rent, or even like low income workers ended up being charged practically half their income towards rent because of a constellation of really bad policies that go back to care not cash. There's also these habitability inspections that end up like basically not being about keeping tenants safe and healthy and keeping the building safe and healthy, but often to build cases for eviction. For example, last year I got harassed over get this blue hair dye on my bathtub, which is not a fire safety hazard. It's not a hazard to anyone. So it ended up like that. Sometimes they'll come up with infantilizing policies. Like I served on the city's SRO task force for a couple of years, and but way before the HSH had its own commission, they tried to like pull a really problematic policy about like not being able to decline wellness checks, and we were the only committee that could like you could hear it, and I actually had to bring HSH into it to like defend themselves, and it was kind of a shit show. I'll admit that.
Oh, just real quick, yeah, note on like Randy Shaw. I think, he's somebody that operates like a typical head of one of these organizations where, I mean, he lives in like a $2 million house in the Berkeley Hills. He runs a local blog, like kind of a news website called Beyond Cron. Um, very, very different life than most people who are living in the housing that his organization, Tenderloin Housing Clinic, provide. And to that end, yeah, I mean, I was wondering if you could talk some about that. Like who is, so you are obviously advocating for people in permanent supportive housing. Who makes most of the decisions when it comes to PSH? My understanding is, yeah, in a lot of cases, it seems to be people like Randy Shaw who are kind of divorced from the realities of people who are living in PSH.
So most of the permanent supportive housing is administered by the city's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, which of course, as you know, only got a commission a year ago. Now, I know that commissions have been a lot in the news about like efficacy, and there's been a move to try to limit commissions, but I think they help bring a lot of like sunlight into the operations of, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable individuals. And there's been a right wing push to get rid of them. But anyway, like there's several advisory bodies under commission dealing with various issues around homelessness and support housing, including one dealing with like federal issues, like for certain federally funded units, and two dealing with the shelter system. But none of them deal with permanent supportive housing, which of course is the bulk of HSH's budget. There's also the Supportive Housing Providers Network. It's an organization consisting of permanent supportive housing providers who are also landlords. So they basically have the right to evict. And while, I mean, they did support like the campaign I led to get rents down to 30%, and we're like really pushing hard for the budget to include that, they've also pushed back on other tenant protections. The last one I want to bring up is the SRO collaboratives, which basically are fake tenants' rights groups. So how it works is Department of Building Inspection gives contracts to nonprofit organizations to basically help tenants, like help incubate tenant activists. But the problem is the organizations they pick are also PSH landlords, which ends up being a problematic conflict of interest. The one I'll focus on here is Central City, which is run by THC, which is also my landlord. So, and basically what it is tenants will often be hired. They'll get a rent cut, do PR, and not really fight for the issues that matter most. And basically, I tried to apply, but like they would rather have kept like my building without a tenant organizer than to have me because I was just too independent. Think about this. If Veritas, one of the big private landlords in the city, got exclusive contracts to basically hire fake tenant organizers, there'd be a fucking riot over that. There'd be like freaking like Housing Rights Committee, all those organizations would be complaining, but I hear a lot of radio silence around the conflicts of interest. And although it's been Hillary Ronan did bring up the issue, like not much got done about it in 2023. The mayor was threatening to cut the program entirely, but I just want it to be separated from landlords, but like there was an opportunity to get the collaboratives to clean up their act, but it never was taken. So that's kind of a big roadblock there for like tenant organizing, and why many of us haven't been able to organize in ways that many organizers could.
So yeah, some of these SRO collaboratives basically act as mouthpieces for the landlords, as you said. And
It's your taxpayer dollars.
yeah. So that kind of brings me to the next question. We just had an anniversary of a hunger strike that you did that was around the policy of getting the amount that people were expected to pay down. Is that correct?
Yes, that was. I know that Central City was very resistant in that. So 5 years ago, I did a hunger strike. It was for most of June of 2019, and I had to bring attention to the issue. So for context, back in 2019, I was, of course, still serving on the SRO task force. I was reconfirmed that spring to a second term. I was actually confirmed unanimously, which is really fucking funny if you know like what I've been up to these days. And in 2019, you probably remember that was kind of a glory days for progressives. Like we got a progressive supermajority. Mandelman hadn't gone off the deep end yet. We of course got like good financial. We were in good financial shape. Like ERAP had come out. And of course, then I introduced a resolution for the task force calling for this issue because I'd been suffering under this. I've been like really, why is the city basically starving us out? Like this is a rent burden that is imposed not by a private landlord, but by the city and county of San Francisco. And all I was really asking and was for 30% to only pay 30% of our income towards rent. Like I wasn't asking to like get rid of rent altogether. Like although I think rent is theft, I was being really fucking pragmatic, and yet I was painted as like the AOC of the task force. And basically, the proposal like literally faced headwinds from other task force members. Clifford Gilmore, who was basically the Central City SRO Collaborative's representative, he also served with me on this, and it was a very landlord tilted body. It said it would lead to unintended consequences and more drug use among tenants. If that sounds really familiar, doesn't it? And resonant today.
That's ridiculous. So people would take that money that they're saving and just straight up put it into drugs, which, honestly, if people want to do that, I think people should have the ability to do whatever the hell they want with their money, as long as it's not hurting other people. But so the decision to do this hunger strike, it sounds like, the message wasn't getting through to these people, and there was, it sounds like, so people on the task force were stumping for the landlords.
A lot of people were either stumping for the landlords, basically were either really poker faced about like whether they would really support it, or there were a couple people who were friendly, but like were often never there because they had some attendance issues. They had some conflicts. So like I was like left as like the only like progressive pro tenant voice pushing for this issue. And of course, like there's another person that got appointed over someone. Basically, there was a seat for that was for a nonprofit employee or officer. I wanted to get someone who was a supportive services person who met the criteria, and got her to apply, but they picked a nonprofit landlord, Dion Roberts, who basically like was tying it up in process and like saying, oh, there's a lot of issues around contracts, which of course maybe there are, but like that's not something for like an advisory body to take on. Like we're basically to advise on these issues and like have the policy wonks figure it out. And this happened like for several months and several meetings, and it was taking a toll on my mental health. And of course, I kind of reached a breaking point in May, like late May. My father passed away, and my I was also to be feted at a gala for trans people, like for my trans activism, and I ended up getting like drunk and puking myself and unable to accept my award, and it was just a hard situation. I was in a really bad depression. I was like, "Fuck it, I'll go on hunger strike, and if I die, I die." And but during this whole time, I did have like an ally in City Hall, Matt Haney. Remember when he was actually progressive? And remember those days? Yeah, he was actually, to his credit, a big supporter of this, and the press got wind of it. And on June 20th, it made the my struggle made the front page of the Examiner, and probably the first time that I ever got on the front page of a major newspaper, major big city newspaper. And so that same day was the task force meeting where it was do or die. I was like basically knew that like people were being really poker faced about it or being really hostile. So I was there with a couple of other people who were really sympathetic and that I brought in to like give comment on it. And like I knew it was going to fail, and I was ready to rip City Hall a new one because of it. And then, of course, the same shit kept happening there. And Clifford was bringing up this in that same article that came out. Randy Shaw was quoted as like saying, like, my focus is on like our unionized employees, and so basically the unionized employees. That's just like like insidiously trying to pit tenants against workers. It was really gross, especially since Shaw had a big problem with unionizing workers in the past, so he's kind of pitting like us against each other. Then, of course, like public comment on the item came, and I was like, my friend, my a fellow organizer, like who was in the same position as me, like blasted the fuck out of the commission. He was like, if you heard the speech, it was blistering. And then, of course, the final vote came, and it passed by one vote. Like I thought I was going to lose this, but I ended up winning. And then, of course, the next week, $1 million was slotted in the budget to start the process. It couldn't reach all tenants, but we're going to do it. And I then ended my hunger strike.
Dope. I mean, yeah, thank you for doing that. It's like an example of activism working and being able to see some of the successes actually happen before your eyes, which is often difficult to know when something's working so much of the time. I think you mentioned the person on the task force named Clifford. Is that right?
Clifford Gilmore.
I don't need to call out Clifford necessarily, but like people like Clifford who seem to be acting on behalf of a Randy Shaw, for example. Do you think that they have been hand selected to be on the task force, and that's why they act like that, or is it like the psychology of not wanting to make too much noise? Like when you're in a position of power like that, I just don't I can't fully understand like why he wouldn't be more of an advocate for people living in PSH if he himself was also living in PSH.
He's actually doesn't live in PSH. He's an employee of the
Oh,
Central City
gotcha. Okay.
Collaborative. And basically, basically, he's the one who hires the tenant organizers, the fake PR people. And he actually basically the other two tenant seats. One was me, and one was the other. And one seat was traditionally given to a tenant in Central City SRO Collaborative. So you kind of had two members of the commission, and one was subordinate to the other. So it ended up my first term on the commission. He had someone who was like this weird cowboy conservative, and he actually okay. So the person that was on the task force in the tenant seat was who was like under Clifford's thumb. voted against gender neutral bathrooms in SROs. Like,
Hmm.
how do you like, it was just really weird. They got another one who wasn't as bad, but like still, and ironically, like he vote the tenant actually voted against Clifford, like on this. Clifford voted no, and the tenant that works for Central City actually voted yes,
Hmm.
which kind of like I guess was moved. I guess he was moved by like all the press coverage, and like he won't admit it, but like it was just like, yeah, that was a
Hmm.
flex right there.
Huh. Yeah. So, I mean, people like a Clifford, I mean, it seems to be the type that maybe poses big problems to people living in PSH. So that was one of my questions that I had for you was, who are the people that we should be targeting in terms of making sure that um, things like people getting eviction notices just because there's a little bit of hair dye on the tub. Who should we be targeting so that those kinds of things don't happen?
Well, I think before we ask that question, you can edit this like little statement out. Like I do want to talk about like the 30 right. Take about 10 minutes to talk about the sort of like what happened afterwards and what happened with the 30 right now campaign and sort of
Yeah.
like how it
Okay.
was.
Yeah. I'll set it up.
Hello everyone, Tofu here, co-producer of San Francisco, here to talk to you about how you can support the show. If you have the extra funds, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/San Francisco. There you'll find all of our past episodes, transcripts, and frequent community posts. Our paid members will have early access to episodes a couple days before they go live on our public platforms, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and we'll have their display name shouted out in the end card of our YouTube videos and our monthly Instagram post. And new paid members will have their names shouted out in the intro of our episodes in the week following their subscription sign-up. Go ahead and follow us on our TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube channel for more additional content and to get more info about the show. Lastly, if you're listening to this on audio platforms, go ahead and give us a rating. And if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and like the video. All of your support is greatly appreciated and it really helps us out. Okay, not so shameless plug done again. And now back to the episode.
All right. So the hunger strike that you went on was part of the campaign for 30 right now, which is the 30% of your income goes into your housing right now. And yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about how that campaign came to be and how it worked out.
So with the SRO task force, it ended up only meeting a few more times before basically some ugly drama between me and Dion, like that happened off record. And basically after that, like I was talking with Jamie Sambamatsu, who worked for DBI and who was actually really supportive of the 30%, like while he was serving on the commission. And I found out that basically the whole reason this whole fucking task force existed was because they didn't want city didn't want to like deal with the issue, so they just shoved it down to a task force. So it's kind of like one of those like creations of city government. So it kind of ended up disbanding later on. But of course, like I kind of like ended up sort of resigning after like it went dormant. So basically, I just wanted to focus on getting this up. And Haney had decided we're gonna like do legislation to address this issue. And meanwhile, they weren't expending the $1 million for the get tenants' rents down, like even if it was selective. Like so, that ended up having to be a protest in March of 2020, just after Haney announced his intention to write the legislation. This was in early March 2020, and we all know what happened later that month. Is that right? So after,
So the protest was happening amidst like, did people have masks on at that point even?
No, nobody had any mask on.
Nobody
like,
knew, yeah.
Corona was starting to like heat up. This is like a few weeks before everything shut down, and I thought, and people thought this was dead in the water, like this was not going to happen. But then I saw like saw like all the protests for like canceling rent and like SIP hotels, and I was like, and of course like at the same time like that I was also bummed about Bernie's campaign sputtering. So
Sorry, as SIP hotels, it's shelter-in-place hotels,
yeah,
which were opened in the midst of like the beginning of the pandemic to have people have a somewhat safe place to be.
yeah, that's it. Like these shelter-in-place hotels, I was really inspired by the activism that was happening, even though we couldn't all be together. So I kind of wrote channeled my inner Bernie Sanders and wrote an email to a bunch of stakeholders, basically saying that, like, we should continue with this. Like, I don't know, like, how we're going to do this, but we must do this. And we started to build power. We wrote an editorial in the Examiner. We started to like get even more signatories and just kept building and building. And then in October of 2020, Haney finally introduced the legislation, and of course, like, got a lot of support from we just kept building support and getting more people to sign on to this document. And we even got the Youth Commission. And then, of course, like the week before, like, they so let me back up here. The In June of 2020, they expended that $1 million to get for people under the direct access to housing program. And in November, right before it was about to go to committee, the BAR ran an article with this indigenous trans woman from Mexico who benefited from like having her rent knocked down to 30%. And it was like it was talking about like how this was having a really positive impact. And then we go to budget committee where like extension of the shelter in place hotel program was on the agenda like right after my item. So we kind of like coordinated with them, and there was a lot of overlap, and we got 80 people to call in, and we even got like Sandra Feuer and Raphael Mandelman to say good things about it. So it ended up passing out of committee and passing the board of supervisors. Aaron Peskin gave a great speech about this, about like, this is a choice. It's a $6 million choice, and we're going to fund it. And then, of course, like, I celebrated by using my stimulus money to take a illegal vacation to Pismo Beach for a few days. So, yeah, I had to just celebrate that. And I was socially distancing, so no worries about that. But thing is, like, board supervisors can't say, like, you have to get this funded and implemented by this date. So the legislation had to say when contracts renew, but you could get the funding, like, in the next budget cycle. Like, that was perfectly, like, possible. So the campaign started to turn into implementation. We started to get the funding we started to, like, do a bunch of like campaigns. I did another hunger strike, and they and basically like there was like this one powerful image of youth commissioners holding up signs that said, Mayor Breed, fund 30 right now, fund and implement 30 right now this year. And we were about to have a protest in late May, right before the mayor was to release her budget. Guess what? One day before, I was like on a call, like, with SDA, like we were trying to like organize around a bunch of different stuff. And I was waiting for my IM to come up, and I was like, got a message from Matt Haney saying the mayor announced that she was going to fund it. And then, of course, that like, ended up leading to like basically a bunch of back and forth. And we ended up having a victory rally, and it was well attended, and it was just really happy times. And I was glad I didn't have to fight for this anymore. As the budget went through the process, like it was eventually implemented in fall of 2021, but there were some rough patches, and some buckets of tenants didn't get it, so it kind of like pushed into overtime. But I was able to wrap up the campaign by December of 2021, and and that was 1 month before I got my vaginoplasty, which of course like required a lot of preparation, and I had a lot of shit to do before then. And I'm just glad that I was able to like focus on like my health needs. And of course, like, my recovery from vaginoplasty during early spring of 2022 also like kind of like tracked along with like, a lot of the return to normal stuff. So I'm ending up living like a much better quality of life than I could have ever imagined like my financial situation had improved, and of course I was ready to like be out and be social in the world as much as possible, and do all the things that I wish I that do make all the dreams come true that had been deferred for so long. So there's so many success stories in this that I can't even name them all. That and there's so much support for it, and that's just like it was just one of those beautiful moments where something really great happened in San Francisco.
It sounds like a happy ending. So, why is this something that you continue to be active on?
I mean, we've already, like I said, like, we were able to win it for every 30% for everyone, but I have never been the type to rest on my laurels because there's a lot of people out there who are suffering from other issues, and I've been like in fits and spurts, like trying to do stuff around this. Like right after that, like I was actually contacted by right around the time when we were trying to get like 30 right now funded and implemented. I was contacted by Joaquin Palomino and Trisha Thadani from the Chronicle about getting about they were doing an investigation, which eventually came out, and we started to organize a little bit around that. And then, of course, like the first investigation came out in April 2022, where it talked about like all the habitability issues, like having all the problems of like putting people in 100-year-old hotels. And spoiler alert, it was more expensive than you thought, and that led to a really bad. That led to the formation of the charter amendment around the Homelessness Oversight Commission, which some of us ended up opposing because it gave more power to the mayor. And then, of course, like the big thing that caused a lot of and then we were also talking about like a permanent support housing tenants bill of rights, where we were inspired by this legislation that had recently passed in New York City around that. So we were like basically like trying to figure out like what are the unmet needs for tenants, like how can we do better. And then of course like the story around evictions came out, and kind of the main character of that story was a Black disabled gay man who was being thrown out of his building because of minor visitor policy violations. Keep in mind, this individual used to have a house. He basically was very social, like would have barbecues, and like I think a lot of things would have been avoided if he'd been placed in, say, an apartment in other part of town instead of some SRO run by some crooked contractor. And sort of like we learned about some insidious practices, like there's basically like a lot of constructive eviction, basically saying like, if you leave now, it won't be on your record, which is like bringing it down. So that led to a hearing with Dean Preston, called that hearing, and we had it in March 2023. We then got a doc. HSH put out a document where they consulted with the Support Housing Providers Network, but not us, on like guidelines around non-payment, which is like totally toothless and optional. But we ended up basically redlining the document to hell, and we it actually mentioned the rent payment issue. Like we wanted to like create more flexibility in rent payment. We wanted to make sure that like some of the examples are also like pre-eviction arbitration because of the abuses of power. Some of the examples were like what constitutes an like substantial nuisance, and we were talking with tenants. We were talking with people from the Eviction Defense Collaborative. We ended up doing a presentation for the commission, which was covered in 48 Hills. Like they mentioned the blue hair dye issue right there, and so we're still and basically right now, like I've kind of after the when we presented, we were thanked by the commission, but they didn't seem to do as much like to really like push this forward. They were claiming like some arcane contracting issues, which I know that they can we can get around this and basically do what we need to do to get this stuff down. And I'm definitely going to renew my call for that. And lately I've kind of like, because activism has been really burning me out lately, and I want to like find joy. Like I've been mostly writing for the street sheet and sort of like talking about issues that are coming up in permanent supportive housing. And that's pretty much where you can read a lot of my stuff.
So yeah, can you talk a little bit about Street Sheet? I've also had a piece in there about SIP hotels, shelter in place hotels, that I won't get into, but we can link in the show notes. Can link to some of your pieces as well. Yeah, totally hear you on that. Trying to find some joy, trying to like kind of move towards things that are affirming as you're doing activism, that still, feel like they are doing something that's fulfilling, but also is hopefully moving things in the right direction. Yeah, could you talk about the Street Sheet, your columns?
I started writing in 2020. Like I usually write them once a month and two a month, like one on the first, one on the 15th. Generally on the first of each month. So you might. So if anyone wants to read it, like usually my schedule is. I usually schedule it for the first of the month just for consistency. But it's the newspaper by the Coalition on Homelessness, and keep in mind that I'm just a contributor. I'm not employed there. They give me a lot of editorial freedom, so I can like basically say a lot of things. I'm free to talk about the various issues in permanent supportive housing, and oftentimes things will come up and I'm contacting my editor and it's like, hey, I got a pitch here, I like to write about this horrible, say for example, horrible thing that Matt Dorsey is doing. Like my favorite fellow East Coast Italian just keeps fucking giving me copy. Hey
Yeah,
Brady,
that is a place that we all need to, I guess, pay attention to, is how some of these legislators, these supervisors, are basically, yeah, trying to attack people who might be living in PSH.
yeah, he introduced like this really demeaning hearing. He also introduced basically trying to prioritize sober housing. And I don't know if it's going to go anywhere because it was kind of connected to it's kind of like contingent on some changes in state law that have will likely end up being so watered down it might end up being meaningless. But still, it's like attacks our housing as harm reduction housing. Like, guess what? Every other place is harm reduction housing, including on the private market, public housing, what have you. And
Yeah, housing
really
is harm reduction. Like with full stop for sure. And in particular with Dorsey, I mean, I feel like the way that he sort of weaponizes his narrative as someone who has been in recovery to sort of control other people, with himself as the exception, rather. I have been to recovery personally, but I'm not trying to kind of hold that over other people's heads and then tell them, no, you have to live here because I say so. And I'm using my narrative as someone who's been through recovery to show that I'm the one whose decision should be respected. Yeah, I am not a fan.
total vanguardism. It's total vanguardism. And I just don't like this rhetoric, punishing the poor. I mean, after all, I'm sure there are raging coke parties in mansions in the marina, or duplexes in Noe Valley, or even condos in Soma, where all these people are pushing
All of these
forced.
politicians make appearances at Burning Man because there's the Burning Man vote. So that they're not sober when they get to the playa.
Definitely not.
You could briefly talk about the retaliation that people can face.
Well, I mean, we've got like I said, we've got several PSH providers who are kind of unscrupulous. They're basically you've got the habitability inspections being weaponized. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are creating really big health hazards. There's a lot of hoarding issues, but there are a lot of people who miss a spot or something. And there's also another insidious part of this. Every I called the Housing Rights Committee after they were harassing me. Guess what? They told me to file an internal report with THC, and basically that's the only like we're the only like class of tenants where if you call the Housing Rights Committee, you're basically told to file a report with the permanent house support housing provider. And it sounds like if you're like familiar with carceral systems, it sounds like the exhaustion requirement of the Prison Litigation Reform Act. If you have ever heard of it, like requiring like the exhaustion of internal appeals before you can go to the courthouse or get.
Yeah. So you're basically acting, or in some cases, you're asking the people who are creating the problem to do an internal investigation on themselves.
Yeah, it's basically like, this links to carceral systems.
Yeah. And that's an issue. Yeah. That, I mean, people in PSH, as we sort of touched on earlier, when you were talking about people who were having the person that was having an issue with having like a couple too many like stayovers or visitors, the number of ins and outs can be pretty slim at these places. It's almost like having you have a limit on how many visitors that you can have in a way that doesn't exist certainly in almost any other type of housing other than like dorms, or like maybe if you're growing up and like, your parents, your parent figures are like, no, you can't have them sleep over today. It's kind of like that.
It's bad. Like, in fact, like many places like outside of San Francisco, like utilize a scattered site model. Other times, like, they put us in apartments as well, even if it's site based, like, we need more apartments. So that way there's like, some visitors, like we can have visitors, like, within reason and like not have to deal with the Kafka shit. And I do want to talk about like how, having a more humane environment really did help. Like in the first Chronicle investigation, they did a story about the Baldwin, which was like very Spartan, like, hotel, like, very small rooms, no private bathrooms, no nothing. And it was basically like, like they were thinking they could run permanent support housing like Frontier Airlines if you've ever flown them. So basically it ended up being a lot more expensive because of a lot of capital needs and operational stuff. And it ended up being more expensive and like more trouble. So it ended up being like decommissioned as a site. And now some of the people went off to go to the Garland Hotel, which is basically another THC shop, but they had refrigerators, they had their own bathrooms, and like we're not even guaranteed refrigerators. Like that's like goes into like pest control, health, blah blah blah, and bathrooms and like even a little kitchenette. And recently, like when a contract relating to him came up, Kristen Evans, who was a member of the Homelessness Oversight Commission, actually praised them for like doing all their deliverables all while on time and under budget. So there are ways to do this that are probably a lot cheaper and a lot more where we can get a lot more for less.
Right. I mean, there's hella empty units in the city, as we know, like in many cases in these like new condo buildings. And the city in some cases would be, like you're right, just it would be cheaper to straight up give people a voucher to live in an empty condo somewhere than in these buildings that where like the landlords in some cases with like SROs are guaranteed a check from the state, or they're guaranteed that the state will come in and help people if it gets around to the end of the month, and like it's a guaranteed payment to these SROs, so they're getting a good deal. In some cases they're not like giving the accommodations that you would hope to get out of that deal.
And also like if we're like in a scattered site setting, and like say the elevator goes out, like there's a
Right.
lot of other tenants who who will raise hell, like if an elevator falls, and like
Right.
they'll get taken serious. Sadly, like they'll get taken seriously. Meanwhile, if we're in one of these SROs, like of course there's been a big endemic elevator crisis for some time, because some of these elevators are so old, and we're putting people like with mobility needs, like in buildings like this where they can only access their unit, and like people have had to sleep overnight downstairs because the elevator went on the blink and they were outside of their unit, or like they were trapped up in their unit for days. And like we've had, it's been a shit show because of the type of housing. And just like I said, mend it, don't end it. Like there's plenty of housing that solutions that don't involve like calling us, or like treating us like garbage.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, of course, a big thing that happened recently around housing and the unhoused is the Grants Pass case, Supreme Court, basically taking some a legal brief that San Francisco helped to write and making it so that people, even if there is no shelter bed available for them, making it so that people are not allowed to, sleep in an encampment unauthorized by the city. If San Francisco is serious about, like, I mean, I feel like that kind of stuff is so cynical that I don't actually believe that the people that were involved in writing that legal brief care what happens to people. But if they're so often basing what they're saying around, public safety. And as we know, like the safest thing for all people would be if people had a place to go back to. And they're not providing that. Maybe you could talk about how permanent supportive housing might be a better way to invest rather than what our mayor is currently planning on doing, which is just upping the budget for the police.
Exactly. Like police probably cost a lot more than permanent supportive housing, and just it's just offensive, like how this has played out. Like frankly, these people are putting themselves in league with actual Nazis. Like I was reading about like how Nazis were like treated, and how homeless people were treated in Nazi Germany. And it sounds like we're getting in the beginning phases of that type of persecution right there. And also like as someone who's transgender, disabled, and has Slavic ancestry, like I would have been targeted, and I'm like worried about like those two being disabled and transgender and being targeted, even though like some of these people wouldn't be considered Aryan. Like they're putting themselves in league of Nazis. And if I had to say like one thing about permanent supportive housing tenants, it's that our success is the city's success. And of course, like when we're successful, like, you don't have like, people who have to live on the street. I live close to people who live, I have close to people who live on the street. Like, I walk past the situation every day. And if those people had a home, maybe they wouldn't be necessarily on the street. Now, I know that SROs have restrictive policies, so there might be people standing around, but that's a function of that, of like, fact that they put us in SROs. But if we are basically successfully housed, like a lot of the other issues, street level issues that all these people on X like scream about, they like get abated. They go away. They don't need to. We're
Right.
all made whole by that.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. I feel like this is a lot, and I think it's gonna give people some insight into what's happening in this really necessary type of housing that exists in San Francisco, and like honestly needs to sort of explode and like become the norm in other places, permanent supportive housing. So in addition to Street Sheet, are there other places that people can follow you?
I generally don't write outside of that these days, but I do have I do have an email. Like, I want to put out a call. Like, if you're a permanent supportive housing tenant, like if you live in Tenderloin Housing Clinic, Episcopal Community Services, or ECS, Conard, etc. Like, if you live there, like, I definitely want to find more tenants to organize. And it's hard to organize tenants because obviously there's a retaliation issue. Retaliation is a lot more prescient for us than even in the private market. And
Yeah.
like, I would like to open up my email. Like, my email is JODAB1026 That's
Okay, yeah.
Jason.
We'll link that in the show notes too, so people can grab that.
And also, I'm on Instagram as my Instagram handle is V as in victory, EG as in Gary, ANPACZKI. So VANPACZKI. So vegan punch key.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you for your work. Multiple hunger strikes, everyone. And yeah, just appreciate you being in town. We'll direct people to some of your columns and hopefully have you back in the future. Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/Sad Francisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.